All right, so DevOps. It's one of those terms, I feel like I'm seeing it everywhere these days, but, I'm still not entirely sure I could explain exactly what it is or why it's become such a big deal.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's definitely become a bit of a buzzword, but there's a lot more to it than just hype.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that DevOps, it's not just about the tools, right? It's really more about this fundamental shift in how we approach IT in general and software development specifically.
So it's not just about plugging in a DevOps tool and calling it a day.
Definitely not. It's more about looking at the culture, the processes, the way teams work together. Imagine like you just took the wall between the developers who build software and the operations folks who keep it running and just got rid of it. That's kind of the core idea here.
Okay, so it's about, breaking down silos and encouraging collaboration.
Exactly. And the goal of all of that is to ultimately deliver software faster, more reliably, without sacrificing quality. DevOps is all about constant improvement, feedback loops, and a lot of automation.
So how did this whole DevOps thing even get started? Was there, some sort of aha moment, or was it more of a gradual evolution?
It really was more of an evolution, I'd say. Back around 2008, you started to see people talking more about the need for more agile infrastructure, better communication between development and operations teams. People were realizing the old ways weren't working so well anymore, especially with web applications becoming more and more popular and the demand for faster releases growing.
So, those were sort of the early warning signs, a little cracks starting to show.
Absolutely. And then around 2009, you started seeing these dedicated DevOps Days events pop up. The term DevOps really started gaining some serious traction. It seemed like suddenly everyone was talking about it.
Like a movement was born.
It really was. And today, you see major companies across a wide range of industries embracing these practices. I mean, we're talking about companies like Etsy, IBM, Netflix, even Flickr. They're all using these ideas to really transform how they build and deliver software.
Wow, from those early conversations to companies like Netflix adopting it, that's quite a journey.
It really is. And one thing that I think is really exciting about DevOps is that it's not limited to any specific industry, because it's all about improving how software is developed, which means it has applications in finance, healthcare, government, anywhere that really relies on software these days.
So it's not just for tech companies then.
Not at all. Really, what we're talking about here is improving processes, which means they can be applied in so many different places. It's interesting, though. Research has shown that DevOps is particularly popular in Europe and in multinational companies.
That makes sense. I mean, when you think about the challenges of coordinating software development across different countries and cultures,
Hmm.
that's a lot of moving parts.
Absolutely. And the benefits they're seeing. I mean, we're talking about things like, faster time to market, better software quality, a more responsive approach to what their customers actually need.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why it's such a hot topic. So we've talked a bit about like the what and the why of DevOps, but what about the how? What are the core pieces or categories that make up a DevOps approach?
Well, I think there are five key categories that are really important to understand: culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing.
Five. Okay. Well, we've got some work to do then. Let's start with culture. What kind of cultural shift are we talking about here?
Well, at its heart, DevOps really thrives on a culture of collaboration and shared goals. It's all about breaking down those silos between teams, getting everyone on the same page, and creating a sense of shared ownership over the entire software development process.
So no more finger pointing or tossing code over the wall, so to speak.
Exactly, and that's where automation comes in. By automating things like testing, deployment, even infrastructure setup, you can free up your teams to focus on the higher level on more strategic work.
So it's not just about doing things faster, but also about removing human error and freeing up people's brain power for more creative and strategic work.
Exactly. And that brings us to lean principles. DevOps borrows a lot from the lean manufacturing methodology, which is all about eliminating waste, streamlining processes, and focusing on constant improvement.
So it's like taking those efficiency principles from the factory floor and applying them to the world of software.
You got it. Just like in manufacturing, you want to get rid of bottlenecks and make the entire process as efficient as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm guessing measurement plays a big role in that, right? Like identifying those bottlenecks and areas for improvement.
Absolutely. You can't improve what you don't measure. So DevOps really emphasizes tracking key metrics so you can understand how well things are working and where you can make things better. It's a data-driven approach to continuously making things better.
So it's all about those feedback loops. Like you try something, you measure the results, and you use that information to make adjustments and try again, right?
Exactly. And finally, there's sharing. It's about fostering a culture of open communication and knowledge sharing between teams.
I can see how that ties back to the whole culture piece we talked about before.
Right.
Like creating a learning environment where everyone benefits from each other's experiences, both good and bad.
You got it. It's about learning from both successes and failures. When you share that knowledge openly, everyone benefits.
So we've got the cultural foundation, the automation to speed things up, the lean principles for efficiency, measurement for data-driven decisions, and sharing to keep that learning cycle going. It sounds like a pretty comprehensive approach.
It really is. It's changing how software is developed and delivered. But speaking of changing the game, how does all of this compare to the more traditional software development lifecycle, or SDLC?
That's a great question. I know SDLC is like the more traditional approach,
Yeah.
but I'm curious to hear how it stacks up against this DevOps world that we've been exploring.
Well, traditional SDLC models like, waterfall, they tend to be very linear and siloed. You have these distinct phases that happen one after another, things like requirements gathering, design, development, testing, deployment, maintenance. And there's often very limited communication between the teams responsible for each of those phases.
So it's like a relay race where you hand off the baton and hope for the best.
That's a great analogy. But
Yeah.
with DevOps, it's much more iterative and collaborative. There's a lot more emphasis on continuous integration and continuous delivery, meaning you have constant feedback loops throughout that entire process.
So it's more like a basketball team where everyone's passing the ball, communicating, working together towards a common goal rather than just running their own little league of the race.
Exactly. And that brings us to what I think is one of the most exciting parts of where DevOps is today, the state of the art. And, cloud-based platforms are playing a huge role because they enable that infrastructure automation and that on-demand scalability, which are key for agility and speed.
Yeah, the cloud seems like a natural fit for DevOps, right?
Oh, wow.
It gives you that flexibility and that scalability. Are there any particular tools that are really popular in this space?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of tools out there, but some of the ones we're seeing widely adopted are things like Docker and Kubernetes for containerization and orchestration. Jenkins is another popular choice for automating builds and deployments. And of course, there's GitLab, which is widely used for version control and collaboration.
Wow, that's a lot to keep track of. But it sounds like the technology is really evolving to support these new ways of working. And what about like the rise of microservices architecture? Is that impacting DevOps as well?
Oh, absolutely. Microservices break down applications into these smaller, independent components, which makes them much easier to develop, deploy, and scale independently. And that aligns perfectly with the whole philosophy of agility and speed in DevOps.
So it's like breaking down a giant monolith into these smaller, more manageable building
It's
blocks.
a great way to put it, and that modular approach makes it much easier to make changes or add new features without having to rebuild that entire application every time.
So we've talked about the principles, the tools, the cloud, microservices. It sounds like DevOps is a pretty complex ecosystem, but what does it actually look like in practice? Can you give us some concrete examples of how organizations are implementing these ideas?
Absolutely. One case study that we came across involved a company that really went all in on DevOps. They managed to achieve an incredible deployment frequency of, get this, over 120 releases per month.
Wait, 120 releases a month? That's mind-blowing. I can't even imagine how they managed to pull that off.
It's really a testament to the power of automation, continuous integration, and having a really collaborative culture. They streamline their entire process to the point where they can get new features and updates out almost instantly.
That's incredible. It's like they're operating at a whole different level of agility.
Right.
What about the impact on like responsiveness? Can you share any examples of how DevOps helps companies react more quickly to like customer needs or changes in the market?
Yeah, another great example that comes to mind is a team that used DevOps to achieve weekly deployments with a lead time for changes of only 1 hour to 1 day. So that means they can go from identifying a need to deploying a solution in less than 24 hours.
That's amazing. It's like they have a direct pipeline from customer feedback to software updates.
Exactly. And that level of responsiveness gives them a huge advantage. They can adapt to changing market conditions, address customer feedback in real time, and constantly improve their products.
I'm starting to see how DevOps can be a real game changer for companies that embrace it. But I'm also curious about like the challenges, right? It can't all be smooth sailing. What are some of the obstacles or limitations that teams face when they're trying to implement these ideas?
You're absolutely right. There are definitely challenges. And I think one of the biggest ones is cultural resistance. It's really tough to change the way people are used to working, you know? Shifting from that kind of siloed mindset to true collaboration, that can be a real uphill battle.
Yeah, I can imagine. People are creatures of habit. And when you're talking about changing the way an entire organization operates, that's a big ask.
It is. It takes time, patience, a lot of clear communication to get everyone on board with such a fundamental shift. But the payoff is definitely worth it.
So you need like strong leadership and a clear vision to really guide that cultural transformation, right? What about the skills side of things? Are there any specific skills that are in high demand in this DevOps world?
Definitely. One of the big challenges that companies are facing is finding skilled professionals who really understand both the development and the operations sides of things, who can kind of work across those traditional boundaries.
So you need people who are comfortable wearing multiple hats and who are passionate about constantly learning new things, right?
Exactly. And those skills are in high demand, which means companies need to be willing to invest in training and development to build up that expertise.
So it's not just about hiring the right people, it's about creating a culture where learning is encouraged and everyone is constantly growing and developing their skills. What about measuring success? How do you know if your DevOps implementation is actually working? How do you prove its value?
That's another great question. And it's one of the common challenges that teams run into. It's not always easy to define and track the right metrics that really show the impact and the value of what you're doing. You need to choose the right metrics that are actually meaningful for your organization and that align with your business goals.
So you need to figure out what success actually looks like in your particular context, and then track the data points that will tell you if you're moving in the right direction.
Precisely. And it's not just about tracking those numbers, it's about looking for the trends, the patterns, the insights that can help you continuously improve.
So it's that data-driven approach to continuous improvement that we talked about earlier. And I'm guessing security is a major concern in this whole fast-paced, highly automated world, right?
Oh, absolutely. Security is absolutely paramount, especially with the speed and frequency of deployments that you see in a DevOps world. You can't afford to treat security as an afterthought. It needs to be integrated into the entire process from development all the way to deployment.
So about like shifting security left, right, integrating it into every stage of the software development lifecycle, rather than tacking it on at the end.
Exactly. And this requires a culture of shared responsibility for security. Everyone on the team needs to be aware of security best practices and feel empowered to identify and address potential vulnerabilities.
So it becomes everyone's job, not just the responsibility of a dedicated security team.
Exactly. And the good news is there are tools and technologies that can help to automate security testing and monitoring, making it easier to integrate those practices into your workflow.
That's reassuring to hear. It sounds like there are ways to do all of this without sacrificing speed or agility.
Absolutely. And that's one of the beautiful things about DevOps. It's about finding ways to do things better, faster, and more securely. But it's not a magic bullet. There are still some challenges to overcome.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground already. I feel like I have a much better grasp of what DevOps is all about, like the benefits, the challenges, and even some of the tools and technologies involved. But before we dive deeper, I think it's important to take a moment and just let our listener absorb all this information.
I agree. We've covered a lot, and I think it's a good time to take a breath and let everything sink in. So, picking up where we left off, before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges of implementing DevOps. And, I think one that's worth digging into a little bit deeper is that idea of cultural resistance. It's one thing to understand the concepts and see the value of DevOps, but actually getting people to change the way they work on a day-to-day basis, that can be a whole other story.
It's kind of like trying to turn a giant cruise ship.
But yeah.
It takes time and strategy and a lot of coordination to change course.
Exactly, yeah. It's a gradual process, and it requires a lot of patience, clear communication, making sure everyone understands the benefits, You need to bring everyone along on the journey and make sure they feel heard and understood.
So where do you even begin with something like that, with like such a massive cultural shift?
Yeah.
How do you start moving an organization towards a more collaborative, a more DevOps-oriented way of working?
Well, I think one effective approach is to start small. Don't try to boil the ocean all at once. Pick a pilot project, maybe a specific team or application, and you can sort of implement these principles in a controlled environment and really demonstrate their value.
So like a proof of concept.
Yeah.
You show everyone that it can actually work in the real world, and then you go from there.
Exactly. It's a lot easier to get people on board when you have those tangible results to show. And it's important to, celebrate those early successes, make sure people see the positive outcomes, and they understand how they were achieved. That helps build momentum and encourages broader adoption.
What about leadership? What role do they play in all of this and fostering that successful DevOps culture?
Oh, leadership is absolutely crucial. They need to set the tone from the top, right? They need to communicate that vision clearly and provide the resources and support necessary for the transformation to actually take hold. It can't just be a grassroots effort. It needs that top-down support.
So they need to be like champions for change,
Yeah.
not just pay lip service to it.
Exactly. And leaders need to be willing to embrace change themselves too, right? They need to be open to new ideas, to questioning the status quo, to empowering their teams to experiment, to try new things. That can be tough for some organizations, especially those that have been doing things the same way for a long time.
Yeah, it's easy to get stuck in those old habits, especially when they've been, quote unquote, working for years, even if there's a better way.
It's a very human thing to do, but to truly embrace DevOps, you need to be willing to let go of some of those old ways and really adopt this more agile, collaborative approach.
So it's not just about implementing some new tools or processes. It's about a fundamental shift in mindset.
Absolutely. It's a journey. It's not a destination. And it's important to remember, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to DevOps. Every organization is different, has its own culture, its own challenges, its own goals. So everyone needs to kind of find their own path, their own rhythm, their own flavor of DevOps that works best for them.
Right, you have to adapt those principles to your specific context and culture.
Precisely. And that brings us to another really crucial aspect of successful implementation, which is measurement, right? How do you know if you're actually making progress? How do you prove that it's actually working?
It's not enough to just say, hey, we're doing DevOps now.
Mm.
You have to show some results.
Right.
You need that data to back up your claims.
Exactly. And that's where metrics come in. And there's a whole world of different metrics that you can track depending on your specific goals and objectives.
I can imagine it can be pretty overwhelming, trying to figure out which ones to focus on, which ones are actually meaningful. Can you give us some examples of some of the key metrics that organizations should be paying attention to?
Sure. Some of the ones that we see as being, really common and valuable are things like deployment frequency, which tells you how often you're actually releasing new software lead time for changes. So that measures how long it takes to go from an idea to actually implementing it. Mean time to recovery, which tracks how quickly you can recover from failures and change failure rate. So that tells you how often those deployments actually result in problems. These metrics can really give you a lot of insight into the speed, the efficiency, the reliability of your software delivery process.
So if you're deploying more frequently, those lead times are shorter, recovery times are faster, and you're seeing fewer failures, that's a pretty good indicator that things are moving in the right direction, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. But it's important to make sure you're tracking the metrics that are truly meaningful for your organization, the ones that actually align with your business goals. Don't just track them for the sake of tracking numbers. Look for trends, for patterns, for insights that can help you make better decisions and continuously improve.
So measure what matters, use the data to tell a story, and then use that story to drive continuous improvement.
That's a great way to put it. The data should be your guide, not just a scorecard,
Oh.
Okay, so we've talked about metrics. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about tools. We touched on some of the popular DevOps tools earlier, but I'm curious about the challenges of actually choosing the right tools and then integrating them effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it's a bit like navigating a jungle out there, right? There are so many different tools available, all with their own strengths and weaknesses. And getting them all to work together seamlessly, that can't be easy.
It's definitely a challenge, and it's easy to get caught up in the hype, to feel like you need to have the latest and greatest tool just because everyone else is using it.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's a bit of shiny object syndrome going on in the DevOps world, too.
Oh, definitely. So, it's important to resist that urge and really carefully evaluate your needs. Think about your existing infrastructure, your team skills, before you just jump into any tool decisions.
So it's about being strategic, choosing the tools that actually solve your problems, not just the ones that are trendy or fashionable.
Right. And it's not just about choosing the right tools. It's also about integrating them in a way that actually works, right? You need to create that seamless pipeline where information is flowing between those different tools and those different teams.
It's like putting together a complex puzzle, making sure all those pieces actually fit together.
That's a great analogy. And don't forget about training, right? Your team needs to be comfortable using those tools you've chosen.
Mm.
They need to understand how to get the most out of them and how to troubleshoot any issues that come up.
Yeah, training is one of those things that I think is often overlooked, but it's so crucial, right? You can't just expect people to figure it all out on their own. What about security? How do you make sure that you're not like compromising security in this fast-paced, highly automated world?
Well, security is absolutely paramount, especially when you're talking about the speed and the frequency of deployments that we see in a DevOps environment. You just can't treat security as an afterthought. It needs to be baked into that whole process from the very beginning, from development to deployment.
So that shift left security idea that we hear about, that's really essential in this context.
It really is, yeah. You need to integrate security practices early and often throughout the entire software development lifecycle. And that requires a culture of shared responsibility for security, right? Everyone needs to be aware of those best practices and feel like they have a role to play in identifying and addressing any potential issues.
It sounds like, again, it's a team effort. It's not just the responsibility of, a dedicated security team.
Exactly. Developers need to be writing secure code, operations teams need to be configuring environments securely, and everyone needs to be on the lookout for any potential threats.
So security is everyone's business in a DevOps world.
Exactly. And the good news is that there are tools and technologies out there that can help automate security testing and monitoring, making it easier to integrate those practices into your workflow.
That's good to hear. It sounds like there are ways to automate and to improve those practices without sacrificing speed or agility.
Absolutely. And that's really, one of the core ideas behind DevOps, right? It's finding ways to do things better, faster, and more securely. But, again, it's not a magic bullet. There are still going to be challenges.
So what are some of the other implementation challenges that we should be aware of? What are some of the things that can trip teams up?
Well, one that comes up a lot is managing dependencies. When you have all these different teams working on different parts of an application, all integrating and deploying their code frequently, things can get pretty tangled up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I bet. It can get messy quickly, especially when everyone is moving at such a fast pace.
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
And then untangling those dependencies can become a real-time sink if you're not careful.
So how do you avoid that, that spaghetti code scenario?
Mhm.
How do you keep things organized in that fast-paced DevOps environment?
Well, communication is key. Teams need to be aware of what other teams are working on. They need to coordinate their efforts. They need to make sure their changes are compatible, right? Clear documentation, well-defined interfaces, a shared understanding of that overall system architecture, those are all essential.
So it's almost like having a roadmap, right? And making sure everyone is looking at the same map before they start building things.
Exactly. And there are tools and techniques that can help you manage those dependencies, right? You can track changes, automate the integration and testing process. All of that can make things a lot smoother.
So it's that kind of balance, right?
Hmm.
Between agility and control. You want to move fast, but you also don't want to break things in the process.
That's the sweet spot, yeah. And I think that's one of the ongoing challenges with DevOps. It's a continuous learning process, adapting, finding new and better ways to do things. It's about striking that balance between speed and stability, between innovation and security.
So this kind of brings up another question that I think causes a lot of confusion for people. It's about the relationship between DevOps and the cloud. Are they the same thing? Are they completely separate? How do they fit together?
That's a great question. I mean, the cloud has definitely been a major enabler for DevOps. The scalability, the flexibility, the on-demand nature of those cloud platforms, all of that aligns perfectly with those core DevOps principles of agility and speed.
So it's like the cloud is this perfect playground for DevOps, right? It gives you all the building blocks and the tools you need to move quickly, to experiment, without a lot of overhead.
Exactly. Cloud platforms make it much easier to automate your infrastructure, deploy those applications quickly, scale your resources up or down as needed. But, it's important to remember that DevOps isn't dependent on the cloud, right? You can implement these principles and practices in any environment, whether it's on-premises, in the cloud, or even a hybrid of the two.
So it's not about the where, it's about the how. It's about that mindset, the culture, the practices, the collaborative spirit.
You nailed it. The cloud can definitely make things easier, but it's not a prerequisite for adopting this approach.
That's an important distinction to make. So DevOps is more of a philosophy, a way of working, than a specific technology or platform.
We've talked a lot about, processes and technology, but I'm curious about like the impact on the people involved. How does DevOps affect their roles, their responsibilities, their day-to-day work? That's a really crucial aspect of DevOps that I think often gets overlooked. It's not just about the technology, it's about the people. And it has the potential to really change the way people work, the way they collaborate, even the way they think about their careers.
It sounds like it's not just about automating tasks. It's about
Mhm.
like empowering people to work more effectively and more collaboratively.
Exactly. DevOps breaks down those traditional silos, which means individuals need to be more versatile, more cross-functional. They need to be able to work across those traditional boundaries and collaborate effectively with people from different disciplines.
So it's about developing like those T-shaped skills, right? Having a depth of expertise in one particular area, but also a breadth of understanding across other related fields.
Exactly. And that can be both challenging and rewarding for individuals, right? It requires them to step outside their comfort zone, learn new things, and adapt to those new ways of working. But it also opens up new opportunities for growth and development, both professionally and personally.
So it sounds like, beyond all the technical benefits, DevOps can actually create a more engaging, a more fulfilling work environment, you know,
Mhm.
where individuals have more autonomy, more ownership, and more opportunity to make a real impact.
Absolutely. And it's about creating that culture of continuous learning, where people are encouraged to experiment, to take risks, and to grow their skills.
So it's not just about doing things faster. It's about doing them better, doing them together, and doing them in a way that really empowers those individuals and teams.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about creating an environment where people feel valued, respected, and empowered to make a difference.
This has been an incredible conversation so far. We've covered so much ground. We've talked about, the history, the principles, the challenges of implementation, the impact on individuals and teams. But before we wrap up, I think there's one more question that we need to address, which is, the future of DevOps.
Yeah.
Where do you see this movement going in the years to come?
That's a great question. DevOps is still a relatively young discipline, but it's evolving at an incredible pace. And honestly, I think we're just scratching the surface of its potential.
It sounds like there's a lot more to come.
Yeah.
So what are some of the trends that you're seeing emerge? What's on the horizon for DevOps?
Well, one trend that's definitely gaining a lot of momentum is the rise of serverless computing. And this is a model where developers don't even have to manage servers anymore. They just write their code, and then the cloud provider takes care of everything else, from provisioning servers to scaling those resources to handling security.
So there's like even more abstraction, right? Less infrastructure to worry about and more focus on the core logic of the application itself.
Exactly. It just frees developers up from that burden of managing infrastructure and allows them to focus on what they do best, which is building great software.
That sounds like a DevOps dream come true. What about other trends? Like, are there any other trends that you think are really shaping the future of this movement?
Yeah, another one that's having a huge impact is the increasing focus on artificial intelligence or AI and machine learning, ML. And these technologies are being used to automate even more tasks, to improve decision making, and to really enhance that overall efficiency and effectiveness of the DevOps process.
So AI and ML are becoming like powerful tools in the DevOps toolbox, helping to streamline those processes and make things even more intelligent and automated.
They are, and we're also seeing a growing emphasis on security as cyber threats continue to evolve and become more sophisticated. DevSecOps, which is that idea of integrating security practices into every stage of the pipeline, that's becoming increasingly important.
So security is no longer an afterthought. It's baked into the DNA of DevOps.
Exactly. Security has to be a top priority right from the start, not something you just bolt on at the end. And I think we're going to continue to see, a lot of innovation and evolution in those tools and technologies that are out there to support DevOps. And that's going to make it easier for organizations of all sizes to adopt these practices and benefit from this approach.
This has been a truly insightful and inspiring discussion. We've covered so much, from the history and principles of DevOps to the challenges and benefits of implementation, and even the impact on individuals and teams. But before we move on to the final segment of our discussion, I think it's important to pause for a moment and reflect on the key takeaways for our listener. What are the most important things that you want them to remember about DevOps?
I think the most important takeaway is that DevOps is a journey, not a destination. It's this ongoing process of learning, adapting, and improving. And it's a journey that really requires a fundamental shift in mindset, a shift towards collaboration, communication, and a culture of continuous improvement.
So it's not about reaching a specific endpoint. It's about embracing a new way of thinking, a new way of working.
Exactly. And it's a journey that can be challenging at times, but it's also incredibly rewarding. It can lead to faster time to market, higher quality software, and a much more engaged and productive workforce.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground, but I feel like there's still more to explore. What do you say we take a moment to gather our thoughts and then come back for that final segment of our discussion?
Sounds good to me. I'm looking forward to wrapping up this exploration of DevOps and leaving our listener with some final food for thought.
All right, welcome back. We've really covered a lot of ground in our exploration of DevOps. I mean, we talked about the history, the principles, those implementation challenges, the tools, the trends. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And, I think our listener has gained a much deeper understanding of what this whole DevOps thing is really about, why it's making such waves in the software world.
Definitely. But, before we wrap things up completely, I think it would be great to leave our listener with some really practical, actionable advice. Like if there's one thing that you want them to remember about DevOps, even if everything else we talked about today fades away, what would it be?
That's a great question. If I had to boil it all down to one key takeaway, it would be this. DevOps is all about breaking down those barriers, those walls that we've traditionally had between development and operations, and even between those teams and the business stakeholders. It's about tearing those walls down. It's about creating a culture where everyone is collaborating, communicating, and working together to continuously improve.
So it's more about building bridges than walls. Connecting the people, the processes, the ideas in a more seamless, integrated kind of way.
Exactly. And it requires, a real shift in mindset. It's about moving away from that siloed us versus them mentality
Hmm.
and embracing a much more holistic view, a collaborative approach. It's about recognizing that, at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And we can achieve a lot more when we're rowing in the same direction, working towards that shared goal.
So it's not just about plugging in a new tool or flipping a switch and saying, okay, we're DevOps now. It's about embracing like a new way of thinking, a new way of working.
Absolutely. And that can be a challenge. There's no doubt about that. But it's a challenge that's definitely worth taking on because, when you can successfully break down those barriers, it opens up so many possibilities, for innovation, for speed, for efficiency, and ultimately for delivering a lot more value to your customers.
So for someone who's, just starting out on their DevOps journey, what advice would you give them? Like what are some of those practical first steps that they can take?
I'd say start with those fundamentals. Build a really strong foundation based on those core principles that we've been talking about. Culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. Let's start with culture. How do you how do you start to cultivate that more DevOps oriented culture within a team or even within like a whole organization?
Well, I think it starts with communication, fostering those open lines of communication and encouraging collaboration. Encourage people to share their ideas, to learn from each other, to work together towards those common goals. And I think it's important to create a safe space for that, where people feel comfortable asking questions, admitting when they've made mistakes, offering suggestions for improvement, all of that.
So, break down those silos, build trust, and create that sense of shared ownership over the whole software development lifecycle.
Exactly. And, that often requires a bit of a shift in leadership style as well. Leaders need to be more supportive, more collaborative, more willing to empower their teams. They need to lead by example and really model that behavior, create that culture of transparency, of accountability, and continuous learning.
So it's about like setting the tone from the top and creating that environment where everyone feels valued, respected, and empowered to do their best work.
Absolutely. And once you've got that, that solid cultural foundation in place, then you can start to look at, how to bring in automation.
So where do you begin with that? What are some of those initial automation tasks that the team should be focusing on?
Well, I think a good place to start is to just look at the things that are, that are the most time consuming, the most repetitive, the ones that are, prone to human error. Those are usually prime candidates for automation. And, not only does it free up your team's time to focus on, those more strategic tasks, but it also reduces that risk of human error creeping in.
So things like testing, deployments, infrastructure provisioning, those are good places to start.
Exactly. And, there are a lot of great tools out there that can help with that. But I think it's important, not to get too bogged down in the tool selection process. Don't get caught up in the hype. Choose tools that solve the specific problems that you're facing, not just the tools that are, that everyone's talking about at the moment.
Right. Focus on the problem, not the shiny new object.
Exactly. And don't forget about the importance of lean principles as well.
Yeah, how do lean principles kind of fit into this DevOps world?
Well, lean is all about eliminating waste, right? It's about streamlining those processes and constantly looking for ways to improve. And when you apply that to a DevOps environment, it means automating as much as possible, reducing the handoffs between teams and just making sure your workflows are optimized so that you can deliver value as quickly and efficiently as possible.
So it's that idea of like taking those efficiency principles from like the manufacturing world and bring them into the world of software.
Exactly. And, you can't improve what you don't measure.
Right. So metrics. What are some of the key metrics that you should be tracking? What are those data points that are going to tell you if you're actually moving in the right direction with your implementation?
Yeah. There are a lot out there, but some of the most valuable ones that we see, over and over again are things like that deployment frequency. How often are you actually releasing new software? Lead time for changes. How long does it actually take to go from an idea to actually putting it into action? Mean time to recovery. So how quickly can you bounce back if something goes wrong? And change failure rate. How often do those deployments actually cause problems? All of these can really give you insight into the speed, the efficiency, the reliability of that entire software delivery process.
So, bottom line, if you're deploying more often, your lead times are getting shorter, you're recovering faster, and you're seeing fewer failures, that's a pretty good indicator that things are on the right track.
It's a great sign, yeah. But again, it's important to make sure that the metrics that you're choosing are meaningful to you, right? That they actually align with those overall business goals. Don't just track them for the sake of having numbers. Use that data to help you make better decisions and to really drive that continuous improvement process.
So measure what matters, analyze that data, and use it to guide your journey.
Exactly. And, one final point that I think is really important, don't forget about sharing, right? Sharing is crucial to creating that culture of continuous learning and improvement. Encourage your teams to share their knowledge, their successes, their failures, their best practices, all of it.
Create that environment where, people aren't afraid to ask for help, to offer advice, and to really learn from each other's experiences.
Exactly. And that can be done through, regular team meetings, knowledge sharing platforms, documentation, or even just informal conversations, right? The key is to just create a space where that knowledge can flow freely and everyone feels empowered to contribute.
This has been such a fantastic deep dive into DevOps. We've explored so much. We've talked about everything from those fundamental principles to the practical challenges to the really exciting possibilities that are on the horizon. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but I think we've given our listeners a solid foundation to build upon. Any final words of wisdom before we sign off?
Just this. DevOps is not a destination, it's a journey. It's a journey that's absolutely worth taking. Embrace those challenges, celebrate your successes, and never stop learning and growing.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of DevOps. And until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep breaking down those barriers.